Hey guys, Z here. Remember the days when saviors weren't the most dominant unit type in the game? That was almost 5 years ago. I think armors at this point have been more known for their role as a savior than anything else in the game, regardless of time period, unless you're Edelgard, who was always a Gale Forcer, except Brave, but she could run Gale Force anyway. Also savior, but most of them weren't really that good at it, so honestly, trying to think about what armors did before acting as saviors is kind of a toughie, considering they were always just the stat ball movement type. I know we had bold fighter quick riposte units and armor balls and cheerleader meta where your bonus unit had to get every single kill in arena. Let's not go all the way back to that at least. Some also acted as omni tanks at one point due to being pure stat balls, but it kind of sucks thinking about how armors haven't really had any diversity in their playstyle beyond save tanking for so long. This is sort of a homogenation issue, but that's existed in Fae for a while, but more on that later. Although that's more on the side of melee armors at least, because ranged armors rarely, if ever, had the same chance to really contribute in that way, which is kind of funny and somewhat sad, because for being in such a homogenized archetype, they sure suck at that one thing. Yet did it ever cross your mind as to how we got to this point to begin with? Why armors and saviors specifically are so dominant and will probably remain that way until either the game or you ultimately implode? Well, good, because I want to take a slight journey back in time as to where it all started and what could have changed. Some of you may have said no to that question, which would render my last sentence moot, but I'm going to pretend your answer was in the better interest of me. But instead of immediately jumping to that starting point, I want to work backwards starting from where we're at now to paint an idea of how Fae ended up the way it did. That currently being with Elm, and I don't think I really need to talk about Elm more than I already did. Y'all probably already know how I feel about him, and if you don't, then this thumbnail might be a good jumping off point. I want to keep the recap section as concise as possible because I've already talked endlessly about many of the units I'm about to bring up in the past, and there's only so many times I could reiterate their impact and use on the game as a whole before I start getting referred to as the broken record if I'm not already called that. So to quickly summarize, before Elm we had Freyr's Edition, which was used in direct opposition of Elamine by shutting off every single start of turn penalty in the game. It continues to be an incredibly potent support effect, even over 2 years later, and it's only going to get better as he's now lined up for an update sometime next year. There's no telling if he's ever going to fall off simply because of that one effect keeping him relevant, partly because of units like Elamine, who was the predecessor to Freyr. Elamine, before Freyr, was introduced as a counter to Bride Catria, who effectively turned all player phase nukes into war machines thanks to Brave support. Said Brave support only came into dominance after the release of Hardy Fighter that notoriously made melee armor such as Brave Hector into obscene tanks. Hardy Fighter did come after Catria, but both her and Hardy Fighter were contributors in some of the game's largest arms races between nuking and tanking, which is still felt to this day. But even before Catria, you had the addition of Near Save and Far Save, which completely revolutionized how armors function nowadays. This was definitely the intended use of Catria before it really became important to bring some extra Brave support. Being able to protect any ally from melee and ranged threats respectively is still so absurdly strong that you really can't go anywhere without one for the most part. But the entire reason we got the addition of savior skills to begin with was in response to arguably the dumbest player phase unit at the time in Ninja Lyn. Ninja Lyn had a slaying player phase brave weapon that allowed her to spam specials really easily and effectively clear through basically a majority of the game. I know that sounds like the average 2025 Fae banner, but it was really felt way more back then, because even beyond her nuking prowess, she could also take advantage of her duo button well before the dominance of duo's hindrance, which allowed her to take another action after combat. This paired extremely well for a lot of Aether Raid's offense teams, especially the ones that were heavy into Gale Forcing, as she could easily set up any sort of Wings of Mercy shenanigan. Ninja Lyn had all the chops to player phase basically everything in the game, and normally this is where the trail would end, being that Ninja Lyn really pushed so much of what we know nowadays, but it was the other thing that really allowed her to do this effectively unpunished, that being with the inheritable skill Disarm Trap. This is where you should go gasp and shock and whatever else that signifies those types of emotions. Disarm Trap allowed any dagger unit to ignore an Aether Raid's Bolt Trap and Heavy Trap, which were the only two traps we had at the time. The Hex Trap wouldn't be added until a bit into 2022, so about a year and a half later. This meant there really wasn't much in the way of Ninja Lyn going in, sniping a unit, Gale Forcing, and doing it again, and this skill debuted roughly a year and a half prior on none other than Spring Pala. Listen, I know it would be a massive stretch to say Spring Pala is the original cardinal sin of the game, but the idea of it being the case is extremely funny to me, and I can't tell you why. Even if it would later show up on Summer Gunthra and Larum, it showed up on Spring Pala first, which unfortunately doesn't mean anything, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Although I think it's fair to say that Ninja Lin wouldn't have been as strong without it, although to what degree is debatable, but realistically, I could have at least seen a scenario where no disarm trap being in the game could have potentially led to an entirely different landscape than what we're familiar with currently. Or maybe it wouldn't have led to any changes and we'd still be in the spot that we're at right now. So, right, yeah, the main point I was getting at, I think the way saviors might have been designed were a bit too intrusive in the grand scheme of things. Maybe it's just me, but when there's one defining core trait to a defensive archetype that many types of teams rely on, maybe introducing ways to ignore them entirely without any real meaningful alternatives isn't the best idea for the game. Honestly, we're kinda at that point in Fae where there's not a whole lot IS can do to meaningfully change saviors, and even if they did decide to do that, I don't think it would be a good decision to either, given how deep we're in, at least without some alternative in check. But that gets me thinking on how they could have designed savior skills differently so they wouldn't have ended up becoming the defining trait of an entire archetype. Although even if they did nerf it or change the way it was compared to what we know now, there's no real guarantee this wouldn't have been the same thing that defined them anyway for years to come. That said, I'm just a guy yapping into a microphone, so my idea of game balance may not mean much of anything, but before you go into the comment section and go, "That's stupid, you dumb idiot," at least hear me out for a second. I know this can't really be done these days given how everything is, especially with like 6 range units and units that can attack from 2 spaces away, even if they're a sword or whatever the case might be. But if there was any way to redesign saviors when they debuted, I think what I would have done instead of having it cover every single respective combat for whatever type of save they were running would be to have it only trigger once per phase or only once for a specific ally's combat. Obviously the former really wouldn't fly with how Fae is designed these days, but maybe it wouldn't have pushed the need for such an arms race if that was the design philosophy behind them. Although considering what else came out that year, maybe I'm pushing my luck with that statement. Of course, the next easiest thing, and I say that very, very, very loosely, they could do is simply introduce more defensive playstyles. I really liked a lot of the Bulwark editions we had last year because it meant some teams didn't have to run saviors and they could play defensively in their own way. You know, before they nerfed it to an insane degree with Lin and super high threat range pass nukes, but that's neither here nor there. Maybe they can introduce a skill that, get this, bonds terrain onto a map like trees and trenches or water tiles or something like that that can reduce the range of some units except Yunaka, because Yunaka can do whatever she wants. And you may be thinking that's just Divine Veins, and maybe to an extent, but maybe not entirely the same thing as spawning a giant tree in the map. Oh wait, you know what else they could do? Maybe IS can introduce an effect that randomly shuffles around map tiles to make traversing maps even more annoying for everybody. You can tell I have everyone's best interests in mind, and I don't know, Vantage? There's like a couple units that can Vantage currently, that's cool at least. I guess beyond that, it really begs the question of what would armors even do if they didn't have their savior shtick. It's not like the player phase is a particularly notable option given the plethora of 6 range units and skill discrepancies, and if they were to still stick to enemy phasing, then they'd probably just be another variant of infantry, which that might have its own issues too. They've always been the stat ball unit type, and I can't imagine there's a lot of room to experiment with that type of playstyle. I'll at least say that it's the one thing that's kept a good amount of them, at worst, very usable because the combination of shield fighter and savior, as well as the other tier 4 fighter skills, lifts up a lot of melee armors. The worst melee armor could still be used to some degree, which is better than most unit types currently. Ranged armors are still kind of screwed at the moment, but maybe there's a niche that could be filled with them specifically that can't really be found in melee armors. The melee side of things are so much more defensive in nature due to better skill accessibility and more BST, so maybe turning ranged armors into a more offensive variant could let them stand out a bit more, even if it just ends up becoming homogenized in the end. Although maybe the homogenization is both a good and bad thing, and perhaps more units should probably have something of that caliber to at least be used at a base level. Ideally, there's enough variation in a unit's playstyle, but I would rather at least have one that works than a bunch that just doesn't work whatsoever. We're seeing that now with healers, which at this point might be considered the best generics in the game with how much support and utility they have at a base level. Maybe a lot of the ways they can expand expand on unit diversity is by throwing every archetype into a specific type of niche or give them their own type of utility. At least then they could all serve some sort of purpose, even if they aren't necessarily as strong as others, and could potentially lead to many more ways to craft teams and whatever the case might be. And maybe this is just a non-existent issue for the sole purpose of dallying up some kind of discussion, but with all things Fae, it's basically non-existent issues to begin with. I think I just like to talk more than I think I do. But yeah, it would be nice to have some more diversified options, even if it's just for our defensive tools that aren't just saviors and ice to an extent, at least to match the pace of the amount of offensive tools we get these days. Maybe by this time next year, the entire script will also flip and suddenly the topic is reversed, but I would at least say it's better to have untankable nukes than unkillable tanks. It's not exactly a fun time to get walled out by a unit for 20 turns when you could just lose in 1 turn. And I'm running out of things to say, so I'll do what I do best. I don't really know what that is. So bye guys, bye guys, bye guys, bye guys.